Welcome to the Night Club, guys. It's your host, the Night Wrencher. Now, as most of you guys might know, we are doing Mopar Monday. Every Monday, we're going to be doing a little bit of something to our 1973 Dodge Charger. Currently has the Mopar 361 engine. Last week, we were kind of talking about replacing the engine for something a little bit different. So what I've got here on the screen is basically a couple different options that we can go through. And the first option will actually be the stock engine, trying to build up the 361, trying to do all kinds of things to it to try to get it up to par with the other engines. The second option would actually be an LS swap, whether that be a 4.8, 5.3, 6.0, 6.2, etc. And the third option is Honda K engine, which is the 2.4 or 2 liter, or I guess there's a K23 as well, but more popular than anything would be the K24. That seems to be in a lot of different like small pickup trucks and smaller engines. I'm going to go ahead and cancel out the Honda K engine in general because I don't think they produce enough torque for the amount of weight that my Charger is going to be set up for. I'm going to need something a little bit bigger. I want to stick to that V8 because it does happen to be a muscle car. So basically my two other options would be the LS and the Chrysler B engine, and we're actually, instead of just saying, oh well, let's just go ahead and LS swap it, or let's go ahead and keep it original, I'm going to go through all the different reasons why we can run either of these platforms, but why I'm going to choose one over the other. So let's go ahead and start with the LS motor. I know a lot of you guys don't like LS swaps, whether you guys are original small block Chevy fans, where you guys are Ford fans or Mopar fans. Most people, even like the stock like Nissan guys and Mazda guys, they don't like the LS. They don't like the idea of taking your stock vehicle and taking out the engine that it came with and throwing something in from a different manufacturer. And especially not something as popular as the LS. I do have another vehicle that has an LS installed in it, and I'm actually very happy with the way it performs. I took off the fuel injection and actually put a carburetor on it, and that's what I've been running for the last couple of years for the Charger. The LS, another LS platform did come to mind. I would probably be sticking to the generation 3 of the LS, which is basically the LS1 5.7, the LM7, which is 5.3, the LR4, which is a 4.8. You also have the LQ4 and LQ9, which are 6 liters, and all of those are cast iron blocks except for the LS1. They're all fairly affordable, but the point of this is to actually keep it under a specific budget. I don't want to go too overboard on things. I want to keep this as clean and concise as possible. So an aluminum engine with aluminum heads are kind of out of the question, because probably the cheapest LS1s are closer to $1,500 to $2,000, which I don't really want to spend on just getting the engine. The next problem that I come up with is motor mounts, which I typically don't have an issue with, especially since I did it on my truck. The main difference between the LS engines and the Mopar engines in terms of mount location is that the LS engines have the mounts at the center of the block, and the Mopar big block, small blocks have the mounts toward the front of the block. So the K members, the actual support, the cradle that holds the engine up into the body, is set up to hold the engine from the front, which doesn't really leave you a lot of room for any kind of aftermarket accessories if you end up swapping that for a different type of engine. So the next issue that we have are transmissions. Since I am planning to keep this in automatic, I can either go with a Turbo 350, a Turbo 400, a 700R4, a 4L60, and a 4L80, 4L60E, and 4L80E, which are the electronically controlled transmissions that you can also pick up as well. I don't know if you guys have been able to look up prices for this kind of stuff, but the Turbo 350, Turbo 400s are actually super expensive now. They used to be a dime a dozen at the junkyard, and now you're lucky to find one in decent condition that doesn't need a rebuild. And if I need to take a transmission from the junkyard, so I have to buy a $300 transmission and then invest another $600 to $1,000 to get it rebuilt to handle basically big block equivalent power, which is about 400 pounds of torque, maybe 450 pounds of torque, somewhere in the 350 horsepower is the goal. But if I'm trying to have it handle something like that in stock form, the 4L60 is too weak. The 4L80s are fairly common. but they're also really, really big transmissions. Although the fourth gear is really nice, there are other options that we can use to circumvent the lack of gears, and we're going to go over that in a little bit as well. So the LS, although it is a much more efficient engine with higher flowing heads, it already has aluminum heads, so you do save money on aluminum heads if you decide to go that route. The fuel injection and everything is not too difficult. You will have to retrofit your tank, run different kinds of lines, run a return style system, and get all that going as well. But after it's all said and done, it's a really solid platform. The only issue that comes from there is cost. So if we move on to the stock Chrysler B engine, I mentioned that the 361 was the smallest big block Mopar. And I completely forgot about the original Mopar 350. And there's also some smaller engines, but those engines are kind of like way too obscure. Nobody really builds them. Nobody does anything with them. And to actually find one, you're probably going to be paying more than any of these other engines trying to find an original Mopar 350 big block. So the engine that's actually in the car right now is the Mopar 361. From what I'm able to tell and the way the valve cover is shaped, the lack of the corner bolt holes for the valve cover, we're talking about an early 60s. I can't really pinpoint because it doesn't have the little pad on top, so I'm going to have to look on the side of the engine somewhere to actually see if I can get a date code. But an early 60s Mopar 361, there's a couple issues with that. First one, it probably won't have hardened valve seats, since those didn't come out until probably the early 70s, late 60s. The second problem is that the valve train on top is completely different compared to the slightly newer 383s, 400, etc. of the late 60s, early 70s. And the valve cover design is very unique. If you try to find valve covers, you're only going to try to look for factory replacements, because aftermarket ones are severely limited, and I don't even think you'd be able to find them. So to make the 361 work accordingly, first I have to find out what kind of dish the piston has, if it has it at all. I've never taken it apart, so I have no idea what it actually looks like. If it's a flat top piston that's pretty much squared up to the top of the deck, then I know I'm going to have a pretty solid platform to start with. But if it's down in the hole a little bit, kind of like the newer 440s, the motorhome engines that are about like a quarter of an inch or an eighth of an inch from the deck, that gives you like an 8-to-1 compression ratio, then it's going to be a little bit more difficult to actually get to that 350 horsepower mark. The second thing we're going to be looking at are the head design itself. Supposedly those heads are supposed to be flowing really, really well. I don't know about the early 60s heads, but the later Mopar heads are supposed to be able to support a pretty good amount of power relative for like the engine displacement and stuff. So if I get a set of 440 heads, which I do actually have, I have a set of iron 440 heads that I could slap on the 361. That would solve the problem with the hardened valve seats. That would also solve the problem with the irregular valve train, and it would also allow me to use replacement valve covers, which should be able to be simplify my build completely. Also sticking to the lower deck design, the B platform, I also have a little bit more room for headers. So as of right now, the way it's set up right now, I've already have a set of long tube headers and everything fits 100% perfect. If I was to pull out the 361 and replace it with something like the 440 of the later years, which is what I have several motorhome 440s, I would gain significantly more cubic inches, but the problem is several. The first one would be that the newer 440 has a cast crank, which isn't a really big deal. They used to make a really big deal about cast cranks and forged cranks back in the day, but as of right now, it's not like the deciding factor. I'm not planning to hit it with nitrous. I'm not planning to put a blower on it, and I'm not planning to put a turbo on it. So the strength of the actual crankshaft doesn't really matter to me, but that's an issue if somebody's looking at those engines. The main issue for me is compression ratio. So the biggest factor for daily driving something and having it get good gas mileage and good amount of power and good response and good cold starts are ignition timing and compression ratio. If you don't have a good amount of both of them, your engine's going to really suffer. Sure, maybe you'll get good numbers at the track, or your engine will be suited to shoot a 150 shot of nitrous, 200 shot of nitrous, but I want something that I can hop in, start it up cold, and take off and get decent gas mileage. I've already figured out what to do with carburetors, so that's not a big deal in itself. But the actual engine, the plan is to have it nice and tight, basically a Mopar version of an LS. And since I already have a built 727 ready to go, all the mounts are already good to go, the engine already runs inside of the vehicle, I think the best option is to abandon the 440 and stick with the 361 and build it up. Another option is to take that 361 out of the car and swap the crank in it with the 440, and that'll put it up to a 413, basically a poor man's stroker kit. So if you, I believe the bore size is like a 4025, but it's bigger than a 4-inch bore on the 361. So if I just go ahead and swap the crank over and then maybe bore it out a little bit, that'll get me at least to a 415, maybe a 420. I don't exactly know, I haven't done the calculations, but if I can get it to a 413 cubic inches, that's well over 400 horsepower if we build it correctly. The cam that I'm looking to install, whether it's an LS, whether it's a Mopar, it's something fairly mild. Basically, I want a cam that unlocks the engine, you know, quote unquote unlocks the engine. It'll give you all the engine potential that you could want, without losing too much bottom end torque. You know how a lot of these factory engines are very severely limited on the top end because they're trying to pull as much torque as they can from the bottom. Well, a lot of these aftermarket cams, especially the lower stage ones, if you get like a stage 1 cam, stage 2 cam, those you'll lose a little bit of torque on the bottom, but you'll gain so much more power up on the top end. And to me, trade-offs like that are pretty worth it if you lose 5-10 pounds of torque, but you gain 50 horsepower or 50 pounds of torque on the top end. To me, it makes like perfect sense. It doesn't make any sense to keep the stock cam. Plus, the stock cam is focused more on economy and emissions more than anything else, and it probably will get in the way of anything else I'm probably going to try to build in the near future. So you got to get rid of all that stock stuff and get it out of here. If we're talking about heads specifically, I mentioned that the 361 does not have hardened valve seats and that I can install stock 440 heads, which I do have. A second option for that in terms of head selection is not only the factory 440 heads, but I have a set of heads from, I believe they're from 440 Source. They're probably about 5 years old, 6 years old, and they've been sitting in a box at my parents' house for forever. And those heads are, depending on the piston, and I go back to the short block, depending what piston's inside the 361, I may or may not be able to use the aluminum heads because of the quench area and the chamber volume. So I'm going to have to do, when I actually get the motor and I start tearing it apart, when it's time to switch over to the new heads, I'm going to need to do a little bit of math and see if I can get the dish, whether it's a dish or a dome or it's a flat top piston. I'm gonna have to measure out the cc's of the stock 361 heads and figure out the compression ratio. Then I'm gonna have to plug in the numbers of the 440 heads, get those compression ratios, and then if I install the aluminum heads, plug in the numbers for those compression ratios. I'm planning to go right up against 10-to-1. I'm planning to stay pretty conservative on timing, still sufficient for the amount of power that we're going to make, but I don't want to go too crazy. I don't want to go 32 degrees, 36 degrees. I'm thinking about probably 28 degrees total timing, but I'm going to bring it in super early. So I do have a distributor that'll work with that, get the weights all set up, hopefully get the vacuum advance going so I can get a good amount of timing just driving around and getting that going. So when I stomp on it, I'll have all the power, but when I'm just driving around, I have no worries about damaging the engine by running 87 octane, 87, 89, or 91 octane. I don't want to go anywhere where I have to use octane booster. I don't want to run race fuel. I don't want to run E85. This is going to be a carbureted build. I do want this basically to be very bulletproof. I mentioned earlier that I want it nice and tight, and I want it to run well. I want it to have good compression ratio. I want it to have good power numbers. I want it to breathe, and I want it to do everything I want it to do. I wasn't seriously considering the LS engine in general because I've already done the conversion once and I know what it'll cost to do it a second time, and since the first time I did it on a truck, doing it on a car is probably going to be a little bit more difficult, a little bit tighter, very specific components. Since I already have headers, I already have motor mounts, I already have a transmission, it just makes more sense to stay with the Mopar small big block. But if I was to go with an LS and I go fuel injection, I would have to spend money on the engine, spend money on the transmission, spend money on the accessory drive to make sure everything fits, and then I'm going to have to spend money on an intake so it'll fit under the hood, and it just doesn't make any sense. Anybody swapping in these LSs into these older classic cars, if they don't do their math right, if they don't get the dimensions right, they're going to be spending a nice chunk of change. They're going to be switching over to the LS6 intake. They're going to have to be switching over to different fuel rails, different fuel injectors. They're going to have to get a tune on their computer, and all that stuff adds up. Whether it's $1,000 more, $1,500 more, $1,500 more, you can basically build whatever engine you want. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense unless it's a very specific thing that you're trying to do. So as for the LS, I'm going to go ahead and abandon that idea. I know a lot of people really want me to do it. But the amazing thing about the small big blocks is that if you manage to find yourself a 400, which is like, I think the 413 is the biggest small big block. The 413, like the B engine. And the 400 is like the runner-up, but the 400 has an insanely large bore. You take that 400 and you install a 440 crank, you're going to have 452 or 453, something like that, cubic inches, which is like 13 more than a 440, but in the package of a small block. It'll basically a small block. It'll be a 361 in size, but 452 cubic inches inside, which is absolutely insane, and is actually reminiscent of what you can do with an LS engine. And LS engines are super popular, they're super famous because of their packaging, because of the amount of displacement and the amount of power you can pull out of it. And I'm telling you guys that there's not a lot of difference between the small big blocks brought to you by Mopar versus the LS engines. And I'm going to show you guys a couple things here. So I'm going to go ahead and close the LS, and I'm going to actually I'm going to do Mopar, RPM, air gap. So if we go ahead and look at this, I'm going to have to put in 440 because the small block is a little bit different. So we're going to go 440 RPM air gap. Let's see. So you guys take a look at this engine right here, right? Dual plane intake, really high rise, plenty of space on the bottom, a lot of runner length for torque. So now if we go ahead and open a new tab, we're going to go ahead and look LS6 Holly dual plane. I think I spelled it right. I don't know. We're going to go to images. Look at this carburetor, or look at this intake. Look at that, and look at this. The similarities are just insane. The biggest difference is that the location of the ports, like the runners, like the Mopar has 1, 2, and then 3, 4, and then this one has 1 space 1 space 1 space 1. So that's one thing to consider. But overall, they have the same general design. The engineers designed the big blocks to have an open space between the intake and the valley. Unlike the small blocks, if you go ahead and look at the small blocks that I was looking at earlier, so these intakes are actually a pretty bad design because you have this whole piece of aluminum toward the bottom, and that actually absorbs the heat from the oil, transfers through the aluminum, and it actually kind of wreaks havoc inside the intake manifold and your fuel mixture. I am not a fan of the small block design at all, like zero. That has never even occurred in my mind. No 318, no 340, no 360, and none of the Magnum engines, because of the intake design, because of the head design, and just because they just don't have the potential like the smaller big blocks do, the Mopar big blocks. So if we go ahead and continue looking at these big block intakes, this is another dual plane, same thing like that. This is a single plane, and ironically, or not ironically, funny enough, so we'll go through and let's see if I can find a single plane. Check out the single plane. Look at that single plane. It looks so similar to the big block, and that I like it. I do think this could work. I do think that the Mopar 361, which is basically, let's see, 361 cubic inches, it's a 5.9 liter. It's only a hair smaller than an LS 6.0. So this is basically a more economical LS 6.0. It's already set up for carburetor, which is fine for me because I like carburetors. I can make them run. Parts are more readily available in terms of like junkyards, if I need specific pulleys, if I need heads, if I break something. LS is too, but everybody's looking for LS stuff. You can't find, in California, you can't find a 6.0 in the junkyard like you can find a Mopar, whatever, a 400, you can still find at the junkyard inside of a motorhome or a van or a truck or whatever, right? The 383s are going to be a little bit harder, but the 413, the 361 was in a lot of industrial equipment, so if you can go to like Craigslist and OfferUp and Facebook Marketplace, you can find them, and you can find them for cheap because a lot of people don't see the potential in them, and it's absolutely fine. People just can't hold on to them forever. Nobody's really going to want them. So those are my thoughts. I think I'm going to go ahead and build the 361. Probably by the next episode, I'm going to go ahead and start taking it apart. And I hope you guys start enjoying this build because it's starting to look up. It's starting to look a little bit fun. So I'll see you guys all in the next one. Night Wrencher out.